No one claimed the last Apache woman until the lonely farmer paid for her freedom. Her name was not widely known, and the few who remembered called her only by whispers, as though speaking her name too loudly might make her vanish entirely. She had grown up among her people, learning the ways of the land, the stories of the wind and the sun, the quiet songs of the rivers, and the dances that marked the cycles of life. But all of that was gone now. The Apache tribe, once proud and full of life, had been scattered, hunted, and destroyed. She was the last, and in her heart she carried the memory of everything that had been lost. The cabin smelled faintly of smoke and wood, and there was a chill that never seemed to leave the corners of the room. The woman had learned to survive in this small space, doing what she could with the meager things left to her. She had a small bed with a thin blanket, a table made from rough-hewn wood, and a few simple dishes. Outside the cabin, the land stretched wide and empty. The trees were thin, the grass brittle from the sun, and the wind whispered through the hills in a way that reminded her of the songs her mother used to sing. Each morning, she would wake before the sun, her body moving almost automatically. She swept the floor, drew water from a nearby stream, and made a small meal from whatever she had managed to gather. Sometimes it was corn or beans, other times just roots or wild berries. She had learned to recognize which plants could feed her and which could harm her. In these small acts of survival, she found a sense of order in a world that felt otherwise chaotic. Despite the routines, there was a deep loneliness that filled the spaces of her life. She would often sit by the window for hours, watching the horizon, wondering if anyone else from her people had survived, if there were others out there who remembered the songs and the dances. The townspeople, when they passed near her cabin, looked at her with suspicion or fear. Some averted their eyes entirely, as though even acknowledging her existence was dangerous. Others whispered cruel things behind their hands, mocking her for being different, for living outside the rules they had created. She had learned not to respond, not because she agreed with them, but because she had discovered that quiet endurance kept her safe. Her life was filled with small memories, fragments of the past that she carried like treasures. She remembered the sound of the river near her old village, how it would sing to her as a child. She remembered the warmth of her mother's hands and the gentle strength of her father's voice. She remembered the celebrations, the laughter, and the stories that had once filled the night sky with life. These memories were bittersweet. They reminded her of everything she had lost, but they also reminded her of who she was and of the strength that had been passed down through generations of Apache women before her. Days passed slowly. She would sometimes wander into the hills nearby, moving with careful steps, her eyes scanning the land for signs of life, for anything that might connect her to the world beyond her cabin. She watched the animals, learned their patterns, and felt a faint sense of companionship with the birds that perched in the trees or the rabbits that darted through the grass. In the quiet of nature, she felt a small measure of peace, though it was always tinged with sadness. At night, she would light a small fire in the hearth, letting its warmth fill the cabin. The flames cast shadows on the walls, and in those shadows, she sometimes imagined the faces of her family and friends, people she would never see again. She whispered to them in the dark, speaking to them as though they could hear her, telling them of the days she had survived, of the new tricks she had learned to stay alive, and of the hope she still carried. Hope had become a fragile but essential part of her life, something she could not afford to lose, even when the world seemed to have turned its back on her. The loneliness was a constant companion. There were no visitors, no neighbors willing to help, and no children to laugh at her stories or share in her work. The few townspeople who saw her from a distance seemed to think she was dangerous or strange or both. They did not know her story, and they did not care to. To them, she was merely a relic of a past they preferred to forget. And yet, despite the isolation, she carried herself with dignity. She remembered the lessons her elders had taught her: strength in the face of hardship, courage in times of fear, and the importance of keeping one's heart alive even when the world seems cold and unkind. Sometimes the woman would write small messages on scraps of paper, leaving them near the edge of the woods where she thought travelers might pass. She hoped that one day, someone would read them and understand. They were not letters to anyone in particular, but a way to keep her voice alive. She wrote of her memories, of the river, of the songs, of the people who had been taken from her. She wrote of her hope, of the dream that one day she might find a world where she could live freely again. The wind often carried these scraps away, scattering them across the hills, but the act of writing made her feel less invisible. The seasons changed, each bringing new challenges. Winter brought cold nights and frozen streams, forcing her to work harder to keep the fire alive and to find enough food. Spring brought fresh growth, but also the risk of flooding and the return of insects and animals that could threaten her small garden. Summer was hot and dry, testing her endurance and her ability to find water. Autumn was quieter, filled with the colors of leaves turning and the soft decay of nature preparing for rest. In each season, she found lessons, small victories, and reminders of her resilience. Her mind often wandered to what freedom truly meant. She was no longer a child, and the world she had known was gone. Freedom, she realized, was not just about leaving her cabin or moving beyond the hills. It was about living in a world where she could make choices for herself, where her life was not dictated by fear or prejudice. It was about having the right to walk among others without being whispered about, without being hidden, without being treated as a curiosity. She longed for that freedom, though she did not yet know if it was possible to find it in a world that had already taken so much from her. Despite everything, there were moments of joy. A bird landing on the windowsill, the first bloom of a flower in her garden, or the sound of rain on the roof brought her small comforts. She found ways to celebrate life in quiet, private ways, honoring the memory of her people and the strength she carried. These moments reminded her that, even alone, she was alive, and that life still held beauty and meaning. Every night, as she lay in her bed, she would look at the stars through the small window. The stars were the same ones her ancestors had gazed upon, and in them she found a connection to the past and a sense of continuity. They reminded her that she was part of something larger, that her story was not just her own, but part of the long story of her people, of women who had survived, and of a land that had witnessed so much history. In this way, she continued her life, quiet, careful, and full of small acts of courage. She had survived when so many others had not, and she carried the weight of that survival with a mixture of sorrow and pride. Her story was one of endurance, of resilience, and of a quiet determination to live, even when the world around her seemed indifferent. Little did she know that her life was about to change. The quiet hills, the empty cabin, and the lonely days were about to intersect with someone else's story, someone who would see her not as a relic or a curiosity, but as a human being worthy of respect, kindness, and freedom. But for now, she remained in her cabin, the last Apache woman, alone in a world that had mostly forgotten her, yet carrying the legacy of her people in every step she took, every breath she drew, and every quiet act of survival that defined her life. The lonely farmer lived a few miles from the town, on a stretch of land that seemed almost forgotten by the world. His small farmhouse sat at the edge of rolling fields, surrounded by hills that rose and fell like gentle waves. The house was modest, built from old wood that had weathered many seasons, with a porch that creaked in the wind and windows that reflected the colors of the sky. He had lived there for many years, ever since his wife had passed away, leaving him with only memories and a quiet emptiness that seemed to grow heavier with each passing year. Every morning, the farmer rose with the sun. He wore a simple shirt, sturdy pants, and boots worn soft by years of walking the fields. His hands were rough and calloused from years of labor, but they moved with careful precision as he tended to his land. He fed the chickens, watered the small garden, and checked the fences that kept his cows safe. It was hard work, but it kept him busy and offered a small sense of purpose. Yet, despite the steady rhythm of farm life, there was a loneliness that nothing could chase away. The townspeople knew of him, but only in passing. He was quiet and kept to himself, speaking when necessary and retreating back to his land when work was done. Some admired his dedication, while others considered him odd for living so far from the bustling town center. Children would sometimes run past his fields, waving as they went, but he rarely spoke to them. His heart carried a quiet sorrow, a longing that had no name, and it made even small interactions feel difficult. He had loved once, truly and deeply, and the memory of that love was both a comfort and a wound that never healed. Despite the solitude, the farmer found small joys in his daily work. Watching the crops grow under his care, hearing the soft lowing of cows, and seeing the sun rise and set over the hills gave him moments of peace. He liked the predictability of life on the farm, the steady rhythm of planting and harvesting, the changing seasons, and the quiet companionship of animals that needed him. Yet beneath all of it, there was an emptiness that no amount of work could fill, a feeling that life had more to offer than the fields and hills he called home. One day, as the farmer was repairing a fence near the edge of his property, he noticed something unusual. A woman was walking slowly along the distant trail, her steps careful and deliberate. At first, he thought she might be a traveler or a lost villager, but as he watched, he realized there was something different about her. She carried herself with a quiet dignity, though her eyes held a sadness that seemed to echo the loneliness he felt in his own life. He had never seen her in town, and there was a mystery about her presence that made him pause. He continued his work but found his mind wandering back to her. Who was she? Where did she come from? Why had no one in the town claimed her or helped her in some way? The questions filled him with a quiet curiosity, a desire to understand someone who seemed as isolated as he was. That evening, as he returned from his chores, he kept watch from a distance, hoping to catch another glimpse of the mysterious woman. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink as the sun set, and he realized that her figure, framed by the fading light, seemed almost like a part of the hills themselves, natural, enduring, and quietly beautiful. The next morning, he took a small basket of food with him as he went about his work near the edge of the woods. Bread, cheese, and fresh fruit, simple things he hoped might offer some comfort. He placed the basket near the path where he had seen her the day before, then stepped back and watched from behind a tree. Hours passed, and he almost gave up hope, but then he saw her approach. She stopped when she noticed the basket, her eyes widening in surprise and caution. She glanced around, as if expecting someone to jump from the trees, but no one appeared. Tentatively, she picked up the basket and inspected its contents. The farmer kept his distance, careful not to frighten her. He wanted her to know that his intentions were good, that he meant no harm. In the days that followed, he repeated this small gesture, leaving food at the edge of the woods and watching from afar. Slowly, the woman began to trust him, coming closer with each passing day. She still kept her distance, wary of strangers and of a world that had taken so much from her, but she accepted the food and sometimes left small signs of acknowledgement. A nod, a quiet glance, a slight smile. Through these small acts, a connection began to grow between them, fragile but real. The farmer did not rush her. He understood that trust could not be forced, that it must be earned through patience and consistency. He began to leave small notes with the food, simple messages that told her she was not forgotten, that someone cared, and that she could find a measure of safety in the world. At first, she ignored the notes, but gradually she began to read them, her fingers tracing the words as though memorizing them, finding comfort in the acknowledgement that someone had noticed her existence. The farmer began to learn more about her without ever asking directly. He observed the way she moved through the hills, how she cared for the small garden she had started near her cabin, and how she tended to herself with quiet dignity. He noticed the sadness in her eyes, the resilience in her actions, and the way she seemed connected to the land in a way that reminded him of his own quiet love for the farm. There was something familiar in her solitude, a reflection of his own life, and it made him feel less alone to simply know she was out there. Over time, they began to communicate in small ways. Sometimes she would leave a response with the food, a few berries, a small bundle of herbs, or a simple drawing in the dirt. The farmer learned to read these signs as messages of trust and appreciation. He began to speak softly when he was at a distance, telling her about the farm, the animals, and the rhythms of his daily life. Slowly, she responded with words or gestures, and their quiet conversations became a lifeline, a bridge between two people who had been living in isolation for far too long. The townspeople continued to whisper about the woman, but the farmer paid them little mind. He had seen the fear and prejudice in their eyes, and he knew that it was easier for them to ignore her than to confront the truth of her humanity. He, however, had begun to see her as more than a shadow of the past. She was a person with thoughts, feelings, and memories that deserved respect. He felt a growing sense of responsibility, not because society demanded it, but because his heart recognized the injustice of her situation and wanted to act. As the weeks passed, the bond between the farmer and the Apache woman grew stronger. It was a quiet, patient connection built on trust and understanding. She began to show signs of hope again, venturing a little further from her cabin, speaking softly to the farmer, and allowing herself to be seen without fear. The farmer, in turn, found that his own loneliness was lifting, replaced by a sense of purpose and companionship that he had not known in years. They were two people who had been shaped by loss, finding solace in each other's presence, and discovering that connection could exist even in the most unexpected places. The farmer often thought about the world beyond the hills, the town, and the people who had ignored her for so long. He wondered how he could help her, how he could ensure that her life was more than mere survival. He realized that small gestures of kindness were important, but they were not enough. She deserved freedom, dignity, and the chance to live her life fully. This thought weighed heavily on him, planting the seeds of a plan that would take courage, determination, and sacrifice, but one that he knew in his heart he had to pursue. Though neither of them spoke of it yet, both understood that change was coming. The Apache woman had survived unimaginable loss, and the farmer had endured years of quiet solitude. Together, they were beginning to rewrite the story of their lives, finding in each other a measure of hope and humanity that the world outside had too often denied them. It was a slow, careful process, filled with patience and understanding, but it was real, and it was powerful. By the end of the season, the farmer had become a constant presence in her life, not as an intruder or a rescuer, but as a steady, reliable companion who saw her as a person, not a symbol. The woman had begun to trust him fully, leaving the food basket with a note or a small gift in return, smiling at him across the fields, and speaking softly when they were near each other. The bond they had formed was unspoken yet undeniable, a quiet promise that neither would face the world completely alone anymore. And so, life continued on the edge of the hills. The farmer tended his fields, the woman cared for her small garden, and between them grew a connection that transcended words. It was a connection born of shared loneliness, mutual respect, and the understanding that even in a world that had been cruel and indifferent, kindness and patience could create something new, something hopeful. Little did they know that their quiet friendship was about to be tested in ways they had never imagined, forcing the farmer to confront the world outside his fields and inspiring the Apache woman to take the first steps toward a freedom she had only dreamed of. But for now, they found solace in each other's presence, a lifeline in a life that had too often been marked by loss and isolation. And in that quiet companionship, they discovered that even the loneliest hearts could find connection, and that sometimes hope begins in the simplest acts of kindness. Days turned into weeks, and the quiet connection between the lonely farmer and the Apache woman grew stronger. With each passing sunrise, the woman, who had once been wary of every sound in the woods, began to leave her cabin more often. She walked slowly along the paths near the farmer's fields, listening to the wind ripple through the grass, feeling the earth beneath her feet, and observing the animals that had become her small companions. Though she remained cautious, the presence of the farmer in the distance brought her a sense of safety she had not known in years. At first, their interactions were limited to small gestures. She would nod or wave when she noticed the basket of food he left for her. Sometimes she left a few berries or herbs as a simple thank you, a silent acknowledgement that she had noticed his kindness. These small exchanges were their way of communicating without words, a delicate bridge built on patience and trust. For the farmer, watching her take these steps was both rewarding and humbling. He understood the magnitude of what she had endured, and he knew that earning her trust would require patience, respect, and empathy. One early morning, the farmer decided to take a small step. He walked along the edge of his field, keeping a safe distance, and spoke softly so that she could hear him. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm and gentle. "I hope the day is kind to you." She froze at first, startled by the sound of a human voice speaking to her directly. Her eyes widened and she glanced around to see if someone else was there. Seeing only him, she hesitated, unsure whether to respond. After a moment, she lifted her hand in a tentative wave. It was a small gesture, but it marked a turning point. For the first time, she was engaging directly, acknowledging him without fear. The farmer smiled softly, careful not to rush her. "I brought some bread and cheese," he said, nodding toward the basket he had placed near the path. She stepped closer, keeping a safe distance, and looked at the food with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Slowly, she picked up the bread and held it in her hands, as though feeling its warmth and weight reassured her that it was safe. In the days that followed, their interactions became more frequent. The farmer would leave baskets of food, each with a small note written in careful, simple words. "You are not alone," one read. "The world has forgotten you, but I have not." She began to read these notes, tracing the words with her fingers, feeling a connection to someone who cared enough to speak to her even when no one else would. The notes became a lifeline, small reminders that kindness still existed, even in a world that had often been cruel and indifferent. The Apache woman started leaving responses. Sometimes it was a handful of herbs, other times a simple drawing in the dirt that reflected the animals she had seen or the land she loved. Each response carried meaning, a small message of acknowledgement and trust. Through these gestures, a quiet conversation emerged between them. Words were not always necessary, their actions spoke volumes. The farmer began to understand her world through these symbols, the way she interacted with the land, the care she took in leaving messages, and the small ways she expressed gratitude. One afternoon, the farmer noticed her sitting near the stream that ran along the edge of her small garden. She was picking wildflowers and arranging them carefully, her hands moving with a grace that spoke of patience and reverence for life. He stayed at a distance, watching quietly, not wanting to disturb her. The sun was warm on his back, and he felt a gentle calmness settle over him. It was a rare moment of peace, seeing her so absorbed in her own world, yet trusting enough to be present near the edges of his land. He decided to take another step toward building their connection. That evening, he brought a small wooden bench and placed it near the path, not too close to her cabin, but close enough that she could sit if she chose. Along with it, he left a basket with bread, cheese, and a small jar of honey. The next morning, he observed her from a distance. She had noticed the bench, standing quietly beside it, studying it with her sharp eyes. After a long moment, she approached cautiously, then sat down, placing the basket beside her. It was the first time she had allowed him to witness her sitting outside, in the open, without retreating to the safety of her cabin. From that moment, their conversations grew. The farmer would speak softly about the changing seasons, the crops in his field, and the animals he tended. She would listen attentively, occasionally asking questions or pointing out observations she had made about the land. Their communication was simple, yet it carried depth. Through these conversations, the farmer began to learn about her past, though she shared only fragments, small stories of rivers and mountains, songs and dances, and the people she had loved and lost. Each story was a precious piece of her life, shared carefully with someone she had come to trust. One morning, as the first snow of winter began to fall, she spoke more openly than before. Her voice was quiet but steady, and for the first time she told him about her tribe. She described the warmth of family gatherings, the laughter of children, and the songs that had filled the night sky. She spoke of the pain of losing her people, of the fear and sorrow that had followed her for years. The farmer listened, his heart heavy with empathy and understanding. He could not imagine the depth of her suffering, yet he felt honored that she trusted him enough to share it. The townspeople continued their whispers, but the farmer paid them little mind. He had begun to see the woman not as a subject of curiosity or gossip, but as a person, an individual with her own thoughts, feelings, and history. He admired her strength, the quiet resilience that allowed her to survive in a world that had been harsh and unkind. In turn, she began to recognize his kindness, his patience, and the sincerity of his actions. Slowly, the walls around her heart began to lower, and she allowed herself to feel hope again. As winter progressed, their bond deepened. They would sit together on the bench, sharing small meals, watching the snowflakes fall, and speaking softly of simple things. The farmer told her stories of his life on the farm, of the animals he cared for, and of the rhythm of the seasons. She shared her observations of the land, the small joys she found in nature, and the memories that still lingered from her past. In these moments, they discovered a shared understanding, a recognition that both had endured loneliness, loss, and the challenge of finding meaning in a world that often seemed indifferent. The farmer began to notice subtle changes in her demeanor. She smiled more often, laughed softly at small things, and even began to venture slightly closer to his side of the land. These gestures, though small, were monumental. They represented trust, courage, and the beginning of a relationship built not on necessity, but on mutual respect and empathy. The farmer felt a quiet joy, a sense that he was witnessing a rebirth of hope in someone who had been through so much. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, the woman spoke of her dreams. She told the farmer that she longed to walk freely beyond the hills, to feel the wind on her face without fear, and to live a life unbound by the past. Her words were soft but filled with determination. The farmer listened intently, realizing that her desire for freedom was not just physical, it was emotional, spiritual, and deeply human. He understood that helping her achieve this dream would require courage, careful planning, and perhaps even sacrifice. Despite the challenges that lay ahead, the farmer felt ready. He had come to care for her deeply, not out of pity, but out of genuine respect and admiration for her strength, intelligence, and resilience. He had learned to see the world through her eyes, to understand the quiet courage it took for her to survive each day, and to recognize the importance of giving her the freedom she deserved. In his heart, he knew that their connection was no longer simply about companionship. It was about partnership, trust, and the possibility of creating a life that neither could have imagined alone. The Apache woman, for her part, began to rely on the farmer's presence. She knew he would not judge her, that he would respect her boundaries, and that he would act with care and patience. In him, she saw someone who recognized her humanity, someone who valued her existence not for what she represented, but for who she was. This recognition brought her comfort, a sense of belonging she had not felt in years. Slowly but surely, she allowed herself to hope that the future might hold more than mere survival, that it might hold freedom, companionship, and a chance to reclaim some of the life she had lost. And so the days passed, filled with small acts of trust, moments of shared observation, and quiet conversations that built a bridge between two lonely hearts. They were learning to navigate a world that had often been unkind, finding solace in each other's company, and discovering that even in the midst of loss and isolation, hope could bloom. Their bond, once fragile and tentative, was now rooted in understanding, empathy, and the shared recognition of what it meant to endure and to care for another human being. As winter gave way to spring, both the farmer and the Apache woman felt a growing sense of anticipation. They did not yet know what the future would bring, but they knew that together they could face it. Their connection had grown beyond mere survival. It had become a partnership, a quiet understanding that two people who had been isolated for so long could find strength, hope, and courage in each other's presence. The world outside might still be harsh, but within the boundaries of trust they had built, they had discovered a measure of safety, comfort, and the beginnings of something new. Spring had fully arrived, and the hills around the farmhouse were alive with the soft green of new growth. Flowers began to bloom along the edges of the forest, and the streams carried the clear, sparkling water of melted snow. Birds sang with renewed energy, filling the quiet mornings with their cheerful songs. The farmer watched it all from his porch, the gentle hum of life reminding him of the resilience of nature. Yet, even as the world around him came to life, he could not ignore the growing urgency in his heart. He had spent months building trust with the Apache woman, observing her routines, and sharing quiet moments of companionship. He had seen her strength, her resilience, and the careful way she navigated a world that had so often been cruel. Yet he knew that her life remained limited. Her freedom was still constrained by the circumstances in which she had been placed years ago. The more he thought about it, the more he understood that if she were to live fully, to step into the world without fear, he would have to act. The decision weighed heavily on him. It would not be easy, and there were risks, not just financial but social and perhaps even personal. Yet in his heart he knew he could not ignore it. He began by quietly gathering information. There were town records to study, local laws to understand, and people who might be able to help. Every day, after tending to his fields and caring for the animals, he would walk into town and ask questions in careful, discreet ways. Some people were willing to talk, offering bits of advice or direction. Others avoided him, suspicious of his curiosity. Still, he pressed on, determined to find a way to secure her freedom without causing her harm or attracting unwanted attention. The Apache woman sensed a change in him. She noticed the thoughtful expression on his face, the way he paused before speaking, and the slight tension in his movements. One morning, she asked softly, "What is on your mind?" Her voice carried no judgment, only gentle curiosity. He hesitated for a moment, then replied in measured words, "I am trying to find a way for you to live without fear, to live freely as you deserve." She looked at him with wide eyes, a mixture of surprise and uncertainty. For years, she had not dared to hope that someone could help her in such a way. Over the following days, he explained his plan in small, careful steps. He spoke of the legal process, the costs involved, and the possible obstacles. She listened quietly, absorbing every word, feeling a cautious hope bloom in her chest. For the first time in many years, the idea of freedom seemed tangible, not just a distant dream. Yet it also brought a mixture of fear. She had been hurt before, and trusting someone with such an important part of her life required courage. Slowly, though, she realized that the farmer's intentions were sincere. His patience, his respect, and his unwavering care had earned her trust in a way no one else ever had. The financial cost of securing her freedom was significant. The farmer had saved over the years, tending to his land diligently, but the amount required was still more than he had comfortably set aside. He spent nights thinking about how to gather the necessary resources. He considered selling part of his land, using some of his savings, and relying on the help of a few trusted friends. He weighed each option carefully, aware that any misstep could compromise not only the plan but also the woman's safety. Yet he refused to let fear prevent him from acting. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills and painted the sky in shades of orange and gold, he spoke to her again. "I will do this for you," he said simply. "I will pay what is needed, and I will help you step into the life you deserve." She looked at him, her eyes glistening with emotion. She had never known such a declaration of care and commitment. Words failed her at first, but finally she whispered, "Thank you." I don't know what to say." He smiled softly, understanding that no words were necessary. The promise itself and the trust they had built was enough. The farmer began taking steps to prepare for the legal process. He visited the town clerk, explained his intentions carefully, and gathered the necessary documents. He met with officials, asked questions, and made arrangements to ensure that everything would be handled properly. Every interaction required patience and careful thought. Some people were suspicious, asking why he was so invested in helping her. Others offered advice or guidance, though he remained cautious about who he trusted. He was determined to protect her, not only from harm, but also from the judgment of others who might misunderstand their intentions. During this time, their bond continued to grow. They spent quiet mornings together, tending to small gardens, observing birds, or walking along the paths near the hills. The woman began to share more stories from her past, memories of her family, her village, and the traditions she had cherished. The farmer listened with deep respect, never interrupting, never judging. He realized that these stories were more than memories. They were pieces of her identity, the threads of a life that had been nearly erased. He understood that helping her gain freedom was not just about legality. It was about honoring her history, her strength, and the person she had always been. One afternoon, as they sat near the stream, she turned to him and said softly, "Do you think I can truly be free?" Her voice carried a mixture of hope and fear. The farmer took a deep breath and replied, "Yes. You deserve it, and I will do everything I can to make it happen." She looked at him, her eyes reflecting gratitude and something else, trust. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that a life beyond fear and isolation was possible. The day came when the arrangements were ready. The necessary papers had been signed, the funds gathered, and the officials informed. The farmer had done everything he could to ensure that the process would be smooth and safe. Now all that remained was for the woman to take the step toward freedom. The moment was quiet but monumental. She stood at the edge of the town, the papers in hand, and took a deep breath. The farmer was beside her, steady and reassuring, offering support not through words but through presence. When the official confirmed the completion of the process, the woman felt a sense of relief and exhilaration unlike anything she had experienced in years. She was free. Free to walk among people without fear, free to make choices for herself, and free to reclaim the life that had been denied to her for so long. Tears filled her eyes, not of sorrow, but of gratitude and wonder. She turned to the farmer, her voice trembling, and said simply, "Thank you." For everything. He nodded, understanding that the words could not fully express what this moment meant. After the legal process was complete, they walked together back toward her cabin. The hills around them seemed brighter, the air fresher, and the world more welcoming. For the first time, she moved with the knowledge that she could live fully, not merely survive. The farmer had given her more than assistance. He had given her the gift of choice, dignity, and hope. She realized that the bond between them had deepened not only through shared solitude, but through the courage to act, to trust, and to care for one another. In the days that followed, the townspeople began to notice her presence in a new way. Some were surprised, others curious, but the whispers no longer carried judgment. They carried recognition of her existence and resilience. The woman moved through the town with a quiet confidence, no longer hiding, no longer shrinking from the world. The farmer continued his work on the land, but he also walked beside her sometimes, sharing in the small joys and routines that had once been theirs alone. Together, they navigated a world that was often slow to understand them, yet their partnership provided strength and comfort. Despite the freedom she had gained, the Apache woman understood that the journey ahead would require patience and care. She would need to rebuild parts of her life that had been lost, reconnect with the land in new ways, and continue to trust people carefully. Yet she faced the future with hope and courage, bolstered by the unwavering support of the farmer who had seen her as a person worthy of respect and dignity from the very beginning. And so, the quiet hills witnessed a transformation. The lonely farmer had acted with courage, patience, and determination to ensure that the last Apache woman could live freely. Their bond, already strong through trust and understanding, now became a foundation for the future. They had faced challenges together, and in doing so, they discovered that kindness, empathy, and courage could create lasting change, not just in legal terms, but in the hearts and lives of those involved. The story of their journey spread quietly through the town, not as gossip, but as an example of what could be achieved through care, commitment, and action. People began to see the value of patience, empathy, and respect for those who had been overlooked or forgotten. The Apache woman, once hidden and isolated, now moved through her world with dignity, guided by the strength she had always possessed and the support of someone who had chosen to see her fully. And in the quiet of the hills, as the sun set each evening, the farmer and the Apache woman would sit together, watching the sky change colors, feeling the wind on their faces, and understanding that their bond had created something far greater than simple companionship. It was a partnership built on trust, courage, and the shared recognition of what it means to survive, to hope, and to care for another human being in a world that often forgets the value of such simple, profound acts. Spring had fully arrived, painting the hills and valleys around. The farmhouse with shades of green and gold. The air was fresh and filled with the scents of blooming flowers, new grass, and the rich earth that came alive after the winter. Birds sang in the trees, and the soft hum of life could be felt everywhere. The Apache woman had begun to explore the world around her with cautious excitement. She was no longer confined by fear or suspicion, and each day offered a small victory, a new discovery, or a moment of joy. For the lonely farmer, the world felt different too. The act of helping her gain freedom had changed him in ways he had not anticipated. He no longer felt the same heavy solitude that had marked his years after losing his wife. The companionship he shared with her brought warmth to his days, a sense of purpose beyond the fields and animals he cared for. Together, they created a rhythm of life that was both simple and deeply meaningful, a life shaped by respect, trust, and shared understanding. The Apache woman, still carrying memories of her past, began to reconnect with the land in new ways. She walked through the fields with curiosity, touching the plants, listening to the streams, and noticing the small details she had once cherished as a child. Flowers reminded her of the ceremonies and traditions she had known, and the rustle of leaves in the wind echoed the songs her people had sung under the night sky. The farmer observed her quietly, careful not to intrude, but grateful to witness her rediscovery of the world and herself. Their days were filled with simple routines that became sources of joy. In the mornings, they would tend to the garden together, planting seeds, watering the soil, and watching the first sprouts emerge. The woman taught the farmer small lessons she remembered from her childhood: how to identify plants by their smell, which herbs could soothe a minor ailment, and how to encourage growth with patience and care. In return, the farmer showed her how to care for the animals, repair fences, and cultivate the fields efficiently. Through these exchanges, they deepened their bond, sharing knowledge, labor, and laughter in equal measure. The farmhouse, once quiet and still, began to feel alive. Smoke rose gently from the chimney as meals were cooked over the fire, the aroma filling the rooms with warmth and comfort. The woman learned to cook new dishes using ingredients from the garden, experimenting with flavors and textures, while the farmer shared simple recipes he had known since childhood. They often ate together on the porch, watching the sun rise over the hills, savoring the food, the company, and the quiet beauty of their surroundings. Evenings were a time of reflection and connection. They would sit by the hearth, sharing stories, memories, and dreams. The woman spoke of her family, her tribe, and the people she had loved and lost. The farmer listened, offering empathy and understanding, never interrupting, never judging. In return, he shared his own stories, tales of life on the farm, his childhood, and the love he had once known. These exchanges were more than conversation. They were a weaving together of two lives, creating a shared history that grew stronger with each passing day. The Apache woman's confidence grew steadily. She began to walk into the nearby town, carrying herself with a quiet dignity that demanded respect. Some townspeople who had once whispered about her began to see her differently. They noticed her strength, her grace, and the calm assurance with which she moved through the streets. Though not everyone understood her, many began to treat her with kindness or, at the very least, with curiosity instead of fear. The farmer accompanied her at first, offering reassurance and support, but soon she ventured alone, carrying the lessons of trust and courage she had learned with him. Their bond was marked by mutual respect and understanding. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic gestures, just a steady, growing connection that was felt in quiet moments. A shared glance, a gentle smile, or the way they moved together through the land they both loved. They had built something rare and precious, a partnership rooted not in necessity, but in choice, trust, and care. Each day reinforced the truth that even the most isolated hearts could find companionship, hope, and meaning when met with patience and understanding. The farmer continued to work on the land, but now his labor carried a new joy. He tended to the fields with renewed energy, inspired by the woman's presence and the life they were building together. He repaired fences, planted new crops, and cared for the animals with a sense of purpose that extended beyond survival. Each task was meaningful, not only for the tangible results it produced, but for the way it strengthened their shared life. The Apache woman joined him whenever she could, learning, helping, and contributing to the rhythm of their days. Spring turned to summer, and the hills became vibrant with color. Wildflowers bloomed in every shade, the streams sparkled in the sunlight, and the air was warm and full of life. They celebrated the seasons together, finding joy in simple pleasures, gathering berries, observing the growth of the crops, and watching the young animals play. Laughter became a common sound, filling the spaces that had once been heavy with solitude. It was a quiet happiness, grounded in everyday moments, but no less profound for its simplicity. The Apache woman began to teach the farmer small aspects of her culture. She shared songs and stories, not as mere entertainment, but as lessons in understanding the land, the sky, and the cycles of life. She spoke of respect for nature, the importance of patience, and the ways in which humans could live in harmony with the world around them. The farmer listened attentively, absorbing these lessons and incorporating them into his own life. Together, they created a space where the past and present could coexist, honoring traditions while building a future. One day, as they walked along a familiar path through the hills, the woman paused and looked out over the valley. "I never thought I would feel this way again," she said softly. "I never thought I could feel safe, happy, or at peace." The farmer placed a hand gently on her shoulder, offering reassurance without words. She continued, "But with you, I feel like I can live fully, not just survive." He nodded, understanding the depth of her words. It was a testament to their journey, a recognition of the courage, patience, and care that had brought them to this moment. Life was not without its challenges. There were still moments of uncertainty, and the woman occasionally felt the weight of her past memories. But these moments were met with patience, understanding, and the shared strength of their bond. The farmer reminded her that she was no longer alone, that the world could be approached with care, and that her life was her own to shape. Slowly, she embraced this truth, moving with confidence and purpose, guided by her own choices and the support of someone who had never doubted her worth. The farmhouse became a sanctuary, a place where both could find comfort, joy, and the quiet happiness of shared life. The land around it thrived under their care, the garden full of life, the animals healthy and content. Visitors occasionally came to the farm, drawn by curiosity or need, and were met with hospitality, warmth, and respect. The Apache woman's presence was no longer a subject of fear or suspicion, but a quiet reminder of resilience, courage, and the power of human connection. As the years passed, their companionship deepened. They celebrated small milestones together: the first harvest of the season, the birth of young animals, and the simple victories that marked life on the farm. They shared dreams for the future, discussing ways to continue nurturing the land, caring for animals, and preserving the knowledge and traditions the woman had inherited from her people. Their life was simple but rich, filled with meaning, purpose, and the profound understanding that comes from shared experience and trust. In quiet moments, they would sit together on the porch, watching the sun set over the hills. The sky would turn shades of pink, orange, and gold, and the wind would carry the scents of earth and flowers. They would sit in silence, sometimes speaking, sometimes simply enjoying the presence of one another. These moments, simple as they were, held more significance than any grand event. They were proof that life could be rebuilt, hope could be restored, and that even after loss and loneliness, two people could create a life full of meaning, joy, and connection. The Apache woman, once hidden and isolated, now moved through life with dignity, confidence, and hope. She had reclaimed her freedom, but more importantly, she had reclaimed herself. The farmer, once lonely and quiet, had found companionship, purpose, and a profound sense of fulfillment. Together, they had faced challenges, built trust, and nurtured a life that honored the past while embracing the future. And so, life continued on the hills and fields, steady and beautiful in its simplicity. The farmhouse remained a sanctuary of warmth and love, the land a testament to care and patience, and the bond between the farmer and the Apache woman a quiet celebration of resilience, kindness, and hope. Their story became a reminder that even in a world that sometimes forgets, human connection, courage, and compassion can create a life that is meaningful, joyful, and enduring. Every morning, as the sun rose over the hills, they would greet the day together, tending the land, observing the animals, and savoring the quiet beauty of life. And every evening, as the stars appeared in the sky, they would reflect on the journey that had brought them here, grateful for the trust, patience, and courage that had allowed them to build a life that was free, full, and shared. Their story was not one of grandeur or fame, but of resilience, hope, and the quiet power of two hearts finding each other in a world that had once seemed so vast and lonely.